power. We do want to go ahead and transition now to some of the other top stories that we are following, showing you a live look that we have there of the White House. We do know that President Biden has delivered his farewell address there from the Oval Office. This happening Wednesday evening ahead of his term ending next week. So during that, he discussed his administration's accomplishments while also warning of concerns that he sees ahead for the country as a new administration comes to power. He did caution specifically on the concentration of technology, power, and wealth, and said that an oligarchy is forming. So to bring in now to the conversation, I'd like to bring in political analyst Rubino. He's here to help us break down everything that happened there as the president was speaking for the final time from the Oval Office. Thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, first, I just want to get your overall thoughts of the speech. It was about 15 minutes in length. He hit on a number of different topics. What are your initial thoughts as you were listening in?
He was trying to do really two things here. On the one hand, he was trying to warn the country of what he believes are the dangers after he leaves office. Some of them he was kind of intimating that he was intimating that Donald Trump, for example, the idea that you could commit a crime while being president and it would not necessarily affect you. That was one thing he was kind of intimating about Donald Trump. But he's also doing what a lot of presidents do in their final addresses. You saw Bill Clinton certainly do this in 2001. You try to outline your accomplishments. You try, in Joe Biden's case, he was trying to make the case that I've accomplished things that you don't necessarily know about, whether it was the infrastructure plan, the bill, whether it was, even though he did not get Build Back Better, he certainly got the American Rescue Plan. I think he could have potentially gotten a little bit more, he could have been a little bit more detailed. For example, I know the Biden administration could often take credit for avoiding a recession by his American Rescue Plan, but obviously critics believe that helped to effectuate the inflation crisis. But he was really trying to do those two things, and he was trying to cement his legacy. It's obviously a time when Joe Biden is leaving with a job approval rating of under 40%. So he's hoping that history will try to revive him the way it did Harry S. Truman, who left with a 22% job approval rating, but later, 10, 15 years later, historians started to give very high ratings to it.
And when we're talking about, as you mentioned, one of the big things that happened at the beginning of President Joe Biden's term was the pandemic. We were still in the midst of it, of course, when they were running that election. It was such a point at that time, just what we were focusing on. Why do you think he didn't go into more detail as he talks about their ability, as he claims, to avoid a recession?
I was surprised about that because usually presidents, I mean, they're very much enthralled in what their legacy is going to be. That's why, for example, Joe Biden, I think, wanted to run himself in 2024 for president, even though the poll numbers and many of the American people, including many Democrats, were warning him, they're admonishing him that he cannot serve another term or that he would lose, but he's obviously somebody who's very much legacy focused. So I thought he would certainly have mentioned that more. My guess is that he will probably, at least in the next few years as the next president, he will very much speak out and he will say, this is what happened in my presidency. He will also have he will have a litany of coefficients that will come out and say, this is what Joe Biden accomplished. This is what happened during his presidency. Usually presidents have people that try to kind of cement their legacy after they leave office, if you will, so that they get credit for what happens to while he was the president. I think the other thing potentially is if the economy does continue to revitalize itself and to revive itself, what I would think that he would want to do, and he would want to take credit for it, as opposed to Donald Trump kind of getting credit for the economy that he comes into office with.
And I think one of the things that we also want to focus on is one of the top comments that came out there from his speech. He talked about a burgeoning oligarchy. He warned of a developing oligarchy here in America as he stressed the importance of holding the ultra wealthy to the same expectations as working and middle class citizens. Rich, I'd like to take this time to go into a bit more detail about what you think he means exactly by that and what he's truly trying to tell the American people to be on the lookout for.
This was never vintage Joe Biden. Joe Biden was never really a class warrior. Joe Biden was, for example, a Democrat that was seen by many on the left wing as being very much, even though he supported labor, being somewhat business oriented, somewhat of a moderate. When he ran for president in in 2020, it was Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren that were really the candidates who were warning about oligarchy, which is essentially just the rule of the wealthy few. I think this shows that Joe Biden he's trying to show many members of the left wing of the Democratic Party who kind of felt alienated by the Biden administration that he was really very much with them, that he sees what they're that he kind of sees what they were warning about, and that he's very much on their side. It reminds me a little bit of Lyndon Johnson when he left office. He was oftentimes seen as somebody who was supportive of the Vietnam War. He had many hippies, for example, protesting him. Then he went back to Texas and he grew his hair long to kind of show, I'm really with you. I think in Joe Biden's case, he saw a lot of people on the left who were very much opposed to a lot of his policies, including, for example, his refusal to call for a ceasefire or to support an arms embargo on Israel. He's kind of saying, look, I'm really with you. I really am a liberal. I just couldn't really show it the last 4 years.
And I think it's important that you brought up the ceasefire, obviously, that landmark deal occurring today as well. We do know that Biden made separate comments earlier in the day specifically on the ceasefire. But what did you think of his notes of mentioning there? Not really going into deep detail as well this evening, but what did you think overall of that as well?
Yeah, I thought that he would actually go a little further detail. I thought that he was probably going to mention that and then mention the wildfires. I think in terms of history, it's going to be a question. It's going to be a lot like the Iranian hostage crisis, where some people give when the final hostages came home, when they actually announced the release was the day that Ronald Reagan took over, and some Carter partisans believe that Jimmy Carter should be given credit for negotiating with Warren Christopher the Elders Accords, which allowed for the hostages to come home. Others say that it was Ronald Reagan coming in that really ended the hostage crisis. This is something that historians, if you go 50, 60, 70 years down the road, some will say that Joe Biden will deserve credit. Others will say it was Donald Trump coming in that deserved credit. My guess is they probably will share a little bit of the credit. It's probably going to be something that's really going to be there'll be really arguments about this really for time immemorial in terms of history, in terms of who gets credit for this act.
I'm glad you brought that up because, of course, we did have covered Jimmy Carter's life and death at a length over these last few weeks, being that he did die on December 29th of 2024. That was heavily discussed, but other parts of the speech that came out as well that we were hearing the president speak about, he warned of a tech industrial complex. What is that, and what are your thoughts on what he was trying to tell the American people?
Yes, I think that he's basically saying that technology, specifically social media, it's not. I think this is where he's kind of trying to sound almost like Theodore Roosevelt did when he talked about busting the trust back in the early 1900s. He's basically saying that it's unchecked, that it's very much unregulated, and that the American people, and particularly when it comes to the social media sphere, are getting information sometimes mendacious, sometimes not factual, and the fact that Mark Zuckerberg, for example, has exacerbated that Facebook will no longer be doing fact checking. This could mean that theoretically a lot of misinformation could get out there, and he's basically, I think that's kind of what he's saying. It's very similar to Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1961 when he delivered his farewell address, and he warned about unchecked power of a military-industrial complex. I think that Joe Biden obviously had read that address, and his speechwriters had read that address, and they were trying to somehow conflate the two, I think, even if inadvertently.
Did you have any thoughts when he mentioned the dangers of AI as well?
Yeah, that's something also I think he's trying to say that, he's looking into the future and he sees that this is something that potentially the government doesn't really necessarily know how it's going to regulate, how it's going to deal with it. I guess you could say the same thing, for example, for the internet. When the internet really exploded in the late 1990s, a lot of people said, what's going to happen with this? Do we regulate this? Do we regulate speech that we don't necessarily that we believe is foul for that matter? So there's really going to be a debate about this, but I think that this is something that's really going to be one of the major cornerstone issues probably in the next 10 years, and then eventually it'll just become permeate ourselves in terms of part of the body politic.
And ultimately, we do know that President Biden sort of ended his speech on an optimistic tone as well. Do you think that was important for him to leave the American people with a semblance, as he said, of peace, and then showing what a peaceful transition of power is as well?
Yes, I think he was trying to show himself. He was intimating he was doing it without mentioning Donald Trump's name, trying to show that he was different than Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, did not attend the inauguration of Joe Biden and believe that the election was essentially rigged against him. Joe Biden is trying to say, I think he wants part of his legacy to be that he kind of brought the country back to homeostasis, if you will. He brought it back to the regular order. I think you also see where he talks about and often talks about his speeches, for example, democracy over autocracy. I think he wants that to be part of his legacy as well, that he tried basically to bring the country back to where it was before Donald Trump really kind of upset the balance of power in terms of the traditional partisan boundaries. And I think I think that's basically what he was trying to do, how his 4 years will be remembered in history. On the one hand, I think he believes that it will be remembered the way Truman is remembered, or George H.W. Bush or James K. Polk were generally remembered as successful one-term presidents, or Gerald Ford for that matter. I think the other side of that is potentially what he doesn't want to be remembered is the way Benjamin Harrison was remembered. When you say the word Benjamin Harrison, the only thing people tend to remember is that he was president between the two terms of Grover Cleveland. Joe Biden wants to say, this is what I've accomplished. Many things my successor may take credit for, but this is what we've accomplished, and he wants it to be on record.
All right, Rich, we do want to shift gears here. Of course, we know that today, as we mentioned, was a very, very busy day, but also happening there in Washington, D.C. This speech came at the end of a day where the Senate committees held confirmation hearings for half a dozen of President-elect Donald Trump's pick, including Senator Marco Rubio to lead the State Department and Pam Bondi to serve as the Attorney General. So many people were tuned into this as well, trying to figure out where our country is going next with this next group of folks coming into office. What were your thoughts on some of those hearings? Specifically, let's start with Marco Rubio.
Marco Rubio is very much an institutionalist. It's very interesting that Trump chose Marco Rubio, not only because they had a very bitter contest running against each other back in 2016, but because Donald Trump is not really an interventionist. He's very much a non-interventionist. Marco Rubio is somebody who very much wants a hawkish foreign policy. So they have a lot of differences, but I think the fact that he was an institutionalist, the fact that he's worked with senators like Elizabeth Warren, for example, when he was in the United States Senate, is one of the reasons why he's not necessarily going to be controversial. I think that he probably will pass almost unanimously. Pam Bondi on the other side is somebody, also a Floridian, is somebody who's very much seen as a partisan. I think you saw some of the questions that were asked, for example, whether or not she believes that Donald Trump was elected, what her relationship is in terms of working with Rudy Giuliani to try to upend the 2020 election. At least their view on it, at least they believe that Pam Bondi believes that Donald Trump won the 2020 presidential election. So that's really where the Democrats are going to try. I think whether it's her, Peter Hegseth, or Tulsi Gabbard and intelligence, those are the ones you're going to try to go after. I don't really see, barring a cataclysm, at any scenario where Marco Rubio loses any more than 2 or 3 votes from Democrats. Maybe somebody like from the Bernie Sanders bloodline, but that's about it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that as we're showing some video here of Pam Bondi. Of course, we do know this was a major pick because Donald Trump had to pivot and choose her after his first election. Matt Gaetz, of course, withdrew from consideration after a federal sex trafficking investigation and ethics probe that made his ability to be confirmed in that position extremely difficult. So we do want to go ahead and ask, what are some of your thoughts on that with Matt Gaetz?
Yes. Matt Gaetz, I think it was very interesting. Matt Gaetz basically gave up his seat in Congress. And then what happened was, and then eventually he decided he would not go through with the process of trying to become Attorney General. He then said that he would not continue in Congress, even though he had actually resigned from the last Congress. So theoretically, he could still serve in the next Congress, but he instead took a job at OAN, where he is a television host. Presumably, he could be a candidate for governor in 2026 in Florida. I think that if he does run, one of the questions that someone like Byron Donalds, who's running against him, will say is, if you said that 8 years in Congress is enough, why did you then run for another seat in Congress, win, and then make the state of Florida pay for a new election? Not that that's going to be a major issue, but he's certainly giving a little bit of fodder to Byron Donalds or to whoever else runs in the Republican nomination for what's going to be a very spirited election in 2026, where Ron DeSantis is term limited.
And Rich, I do want to ask you this before I let you go. Of course, a lot of the conversation online about Trump's cabinet picks has to do with loyalty. They're saying that this time around, unlike 2020, he's truly focusing on making picks that he feels will remain loyal to him during his time in office. In fact, that question was even asked to Pam Bondi whether or not she would have sort of a hit list to go after Trump's enemies once she is Attorney General. What are your thoughts overall on that? And do you believe that that is some of the reasoning why he made some of his selections?
Yes, absolutely. Even someone like Marco Rubio, who showed independence from Donald Trump, certainly in the beginning of his presidency, generally speaking, in the United States Senate, was able to show a certain fidelity toward Donald Trump, whereas I think Donald Trump was able to excuse some of their ideological difference when it comes to the foreign policy sphere. But if you look at, for example, the candidates that he endorses in the House races and the Senate races, they're running in primary. They tend to be the candidates who speak the most loyal of Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that they've always been loyal to Donald Trump. J.D. Vance is a perfect example of that in the past, being very negative about Donald Trump and comparing him to America's Hitler. But the fact of the matter is that when it push came to shove, when J.D. Vance ran for Senate, he showed that he said he was going to be very loyal to Donald Trump. And in the United States Senate, he was extremely loyal to Donald Trump. He earned that loyalty. So you can earn loyalty. But the one thing Donald Trump does not want is the possibility of somebody that he could nominate going rogue, or for that matter, being more of an institutionalist and perhaps working across the aisle when Donald Trump does not want that to happen. So it's a very fine line. But I think folks like Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, or for that matter, go to his first administration, you had Rick Perry becoming energy secretary. Rick Perry ran a very bitter campaign against Donald Trump. But when push came to shove, Rick Perry showed us loyalty. Donald Trump supported him. Ted Cruz, he used to call Lion Ted. But in 2018, when Ted Cruz ran for re-election, Donald Trump was right there because in those first 2 years, Ted Cruz had been very fidelitous toward Donald Trump.
Certainly something that we're going to continue to follow here on Live Now from Fox. I want to put this up one last time before I let you go. Rich, do you have any thoughts on any of these that are scheduled for tomorrow as well? We do know Doug Burgum, the Interior Department, Scott Turner, Housing and Urban Development Department, Lee Zeldin, Environmental Protection Agency. Pam Bondi will go into day 2 of her confirmation hearings there for Attorney General, as well as Scott Bessent, the Treasury Department. What are your thoughts here as we look ahead to tomorrow? Is there any one of these that you think will stand out more than the others?
I think probably Lee Zeldin. I think he's going to be confirmed, but I think there's going to be a lot of opposition. I think they're going to be asked the questions. I think that many of the Democratic senators, even though they don't have the votes in the committee, are going to be asking him questions. Do you believe in climate change? Something to that effect. Do you support Donald Trump's view on climate change? So that's something that I really think is going to get a lot of potential media play. But at the end of the day, all they need is 50 votes. And I think that even if you have Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski potentially voting against him, you're probably going to have just about the entire United States Senate that are Republicans voting for him. So I don't see any of those really being that much contested. Folks like Doug Burgum, for example, should be a slam dunk for Donald Trump. He really hasn't created much waves. You might see some questions from the Democratic senators. Again, for example, he's up for in the Interior Department. Might ask him, and they might ask some questions just generally how he will be loyal to Donald Trump, but I really don't see that necessarily being. I don't see that. Seeing that being like Marco Rubio, something that could get almost unanimous support.
Certainly something that we're going to continue to track here on Live Now from Fox. I want to thank you for your time, Rich Rubino, political analyst, here to help us break down some of the biggest news of the day. Of course, Biden's farewell speech, as well as some of these key Senate confirmation hearings that we've been tracking here on Live Now. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me on.